Uh, it was one of those days where the grind of corporate life felt relentless, the kind of day that stretched endlessly with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the faint hum of printers in the background. I had been working at Grant and Sinclair, a mid-size marketing firm in the heart of downtown, for nearly 5 years, and though I'd made a name for myself as a diligent and creative team leader, the cost of my success often felt unbearable. My husband Sam once joked that I'd married my job instead of him. Lately, his humor had turned into bitter quips, each one cutting deeper than the last. That day started as usual, with me rushing out of the house, barely taking a second to kiss Sam goodbye. He stood by the sink, his expression unreadable as I grabbed my coffee. "Late again?" he asked, his voice a mix of sarcasm and resignation. I didn't reply. What was there to say? I had a deadline, a client meeting, and a boss who expected nothing short of perfection. Sam used to understand my ambition. When we first got married, he'd proudly tell his friends how driven I was, how he admired my work ethic. But as the years passed, admiration turned to frustration. He wanted movie nights, lazy Sunday mornings, and quiet dinners where I wasn't checking emails under the table. I wanted to prove myself in a company where promotions were as elusive as a weekend off. When I reached the office that morning, my boss, Ethan Cole, was already there. Ethan had a presence that filled a room. He was the kind of man who exuded confidence effortlessly, a sharp suit, perfectly tousled hair, and a voice that commanded attention without ever needing to shout. At 45, he was a decade older than me, but seemed to carry the energy of someone younger. He had an eye for talent, or so he'd said the first time he hired me. Back then, his approval had been the fuel for my fire, but over the years it had become something I craved more than I wanted to admit. "Emma? In my office," Ethan called out as I dropped my bag at my desk. His tone was curt as usual, but there was a slight upward curl to his lips, a rare hint of approval. I hurried in, clutching my notebook. The meeting was about a new client, a high-profile cosmetics brand that could propel the firm into the big leagues. Ethan laid out his vision, his words precise and compelling, while I took notes, occasionally chiming in with ideas. Every time he nodded at something I said, a small flicker of pride lit up inside me. It was silly, I knew, to seek validation from him, but there was something magnetic about Ethan, something that made me want to be better, sharper, more than I was. As the day wore on, I barely noticed the time. Calls, emails, and brainstorming sessions filled every moment, leaving little room for anything else. Around 7 p.m., most of the office had cleared out. I was gathering my things when Ethan approached my desk. "Still here?" he asked, his voice warm but tinged with surprise. I shrugged, attempting a casual smile. "Deadlines don't meet themselves." He chuckled. "True." "Want a coffee? I could use a pick-me-up." Before I could answer, he was already walking toward the break room. I hesitated for a moment before following him. It wasn't unusual for Ethan to be friendly, but it wasn't common either. He was a man of boundaries, one who kept his personal life locked away and his professional demeanor unshakable. In the break room, the harsh lighting softened Ethan's features. He handed me a mug and leaned against the counter, his sleeves rolled up, revealing toned forearms. "How's the campaign shaping up?" he asked, his eyes locking onto mine. "It's coming together," I replied, sipping the coffee. "Still a few loose ends, but we'll hit the deadline." "I don't doubt it," he said, his tone sincere. "You're one of the best I've got." The compliment caught me off guard. Ethan wasn't known for dishing out praise. I felt a blush rise to my cheeks and quickly looked away, pretending to focus on the coffee machine. "Thanks," I muttered. "That means a lot." Silence settled between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt charged. Ethan cleared his throat and pushed off the counter. "Well, don't let me keep you. Have a good night, Emma." "You too," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. I didn't leave the office until nearly 9 p.m., my mind still replaying the brief exchange in the break room. By the time I got home, Sam was already in bed. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the heater. I crept into the bedroom, careful not to wake him, but as I slipped under the covers, he stirred. "Late again," he mumbled, his voice heavy with sleep. "I'm sorry," I whispered, but the apology felt hollow. I wasn't sure who I was apologizing to, Sam or myself. The next morning, I arrived at work to find the office abuzz with news of a last-minute presentation Ethan wanted us to prepare. The deadline was tight, the pressure immense. By the time the day ended, only a handful of us were left, scrambling to finish. As I was heading to the elevator with Ethan to deliver the final draft to the client's office, the power suddenly went out. The lights flickered and died, leaving us in near darkness. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest, but Ethan's calm voice cut through it. "Looks like we're stuck," he said, his tone surprisingly composed. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the small space. Ethan leaned against the wall, his hands in his pockets, looking more amused than annoyed. "Well, this is one way to end the day," he quipped, a faint smile on his lips. I couldn't help but laugh, the sound echoing in the confined space. "Could be worse," I said. "At least we have company." Ethan's smile widened. "True. So, Emma, what's the plan?" "The plan?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," he said, crossing his arms. "You're the one who always has it together. Got any bright ideas?" I rolled my eyes but felt a flicker of warmth at his teasing tone. Guess we wait for maintenance to fix it. The minutes stretched into an hour, and the conversation flowed more naturally than I expected. Ethan asked about my career aspirations, my hobbies, even my favorite coffee shop in the city. It was the most personal conversation we'd ever had, and I found myself opening up in a way that felt natural. As the elevator remained still, the air between us shifted. The professional veneer we always maintained seemed to crack, revealing glimpses of something deeper. Ethan's gaze lingered a second too long, and I felt a flutter of something I couldn't name. When the power finally came back, the moment dissolved as quickly as it had formed. The doors opened, and we stepped out, the hum of the office quickly pulling us back into reality. But as I walked to my desk, my heart still raced, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something I wasn't ready to admit, even to myself. The next morning, I arrived at the office trying to brush off the lingering thoughts of the night before. Ethan's voice, his warm chuckle, the way he seemed genuinely interested in my life, those moments replayed in my mind like a song stuck on repeat. I told myself it was nothing, just idle conversation between two colleagues trapped in an elevator. But as I sat at my desk, I found myself glancing toward his office, more than usual, wondering if he was thinking about it too. By midday, Ethan had summoned me for a meeting with the team. We were presenting our progress to the executives. I'd rehearsed my portion several times, confident in my ideas, but when I walked into the boardroom, I felt the weight of his gaze. His eyes met mine, and a small smile curved his lips, barely noticeable, but enough to send a ripple of heat through me. I swallowed hard, taking my seat at the far end of the table to put as much distance between us as possible. The meeting went smoothly, my presentation earning nods of approval from the executives, but it was Ethan's quiet, "Good work, Emma," as we left the room, that lingered with me long after. I tried to focus on my tasks, but my thoughts kept drifting to him. The way he leaned slightly closer when I spoke, the subtle way his tones softened when addressing me. It was becoming harder to dismiss as mere professionalism. That evening, I stayed late again. The office was quiet, the orn hum of computers and occasional creak of the air conditioner the only sounds. I was wrapping up when Ethan's voice startled me. "Burning the midnight oil again?" I spun around, my heart racing. "Guess I'm getting predictable." He chuckled, leaning against the doorframe. "We're just dedicated." There it was again, that tone, warm and laced with something I couldn't quite place. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. My breath caught. Alone with him again, the memory of the elevator, the way we'd laughed and shared glimpses of our lives, hung in the air between us. "You've been doing incredible work, Emma," he said, his voice sincere. "I don't say it enough, but I want you to know it doesn't go unnoticed." I smiled, a mix of pride and unease tightening my chest. "Thank you, that means a lot." Ethan took a step closer, his gaze holding mine. "You are more than just good at your job. You've got something that makes people take notice." My pulse quickened. Was it admiration? Flattery? Something more? I searched his face for clues, but his expression was unreadable, his words hanging heavy in the room. "I should probably finish up," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Of course. I'll let you get to it." But as he turned to leave, he paused. "Emma? Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve every bit of success coming your way. You've earned it." And with that, he was gone, leaving me reeling. His words were kind, uplifting even, but the way he said them, like they carried a weight he wasn't ready to fully acknowledge, made my stomach churn with emotions I wasn't ready to name. The next week was a whirlwind of client meetings and deadlines, but the tension between Ethan and me only seemed to grow. It was in the small moments, the way his hand lingered on mine when he handed me a file, the quiet good mornings that felt far more intimate than they should. I found myself drawn to him in ways that made me question everything. It wasn't just his charm or his good looks, it was the way he made me feel seen, valued, like my efforts weren't just another cog in the corporate machine. But then there was Sam. Each time I walked through our front door, the weight of my double life crushed me. Sam's questions, "How was work?" or "Are you ever going to take a night off?" cut deeper than usual. I tried to tell myself that I was just imagining things with Ethan, that I was projecting my dissatisfaction with my marriage onto him. But every time I saw him, every time he smiled at me or said my name, the walls I'd built around my emotions cracked a little more. The breaking point came during a late-night brainstorming session. Ethan and I were the last ones in the office again, poring over campaign strategies in his glass-walled office. The city lights twinkled outside, casting a soft glow that made the room feel strangely intimate. "You've got a knack for this," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair and studying me with those piercing gray eyes. "I don't know how you do it." I laughed, trying to deflect the praise. "It's just years of practice." "No," he said, his voice quieter now. "It's more than that. You have something special." The air between us grew thick, the unspoken tension we'd both been ignoring pressing down on us. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the desk. "Emma," he said softly, "do you ever feel like you're stuck in a loop? Like no matter how hard you try, you're always chasing something just out of reach?" The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard. "All the time," I admitted, my own voice trembling. "But I tell myself it's worth it, that one day I'll get there." Ethan's gaze held mine, and for a moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. Sometimes I wonder if what we're chasing is even the right thing. His words struck a nerve, echoing thoughts I'd buried deep. My marriage, my career, my restless need to prove myself. They all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite fit together. "I think about that too," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. We sat there in silence, the weight of our words filling the room, and then, slowly, Ethan reached across the desk, his hand brushing against mine. The contact was electric, sending a jolt through me that made my breath hitch. I should have pulled away, should have said something to break the moment. But I didn't. Instead, I let the warmth of his touch wash over me, my heart pounding in my chest. "Emma," he said, his voice low and filled with something I couldn't name. Before either of us could say another word, the sound of a door opening in the distance broke the spell. I pulled my hand back quickly, my cheeks burning, as Ethan leaned back in his chair. The moment shattered. That night, as I drove home, my mind raced. I couldn't deny what was happening anymore. Something had shifted between us, something I couldn't ignore. But as I pulled into my driveway and saw Sam's car parked outside, the weight of my choices crashed down on me. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the front door. Inside was my husband, the man I'd promised to love and cherish, but in the quiet of the night all I could think about was Ethan, his voice, his touch, and the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. When I finally walked through the door, Sam looked up from the couch, his face lighting up with a smile. "Hey," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "How was work?" I forced a smile, the guilt clawing at me. "Long," I said simply, brushing past him to the bedroom. "I'm going to shower." As the water cascaded over me, I closed my eyes and let the tears fall. I was standing at the edge of a precipice, and I didn't know how to stop myself from falling. The days after that night felt like walking a tightrope. Every interaction with Ethan carried an undercurrent of tension, unspoken words hanging between us, like a fragile thread threatening to snap. At home, Sam's questions grew more pointed. He noticed the distance I was putting between us, though I tried my best to mask it. Guilt settled like a stone in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to confront the feelings that had begun to dominate my thoughts. One morning, Ethan asked me to join him for a meeting with a potential client. It wasn't unusual for him to bring me along. I'd been handling the creative side of our campaigns for years, but something about this request felt different. His tone was softer, almost hesitant, as if he knew he was pushing the boundaries of our professional relationship. Still, I said yes. The meeting took place at an upscale downtown restaurant. the kind of place where the waitstaff wore crisp suits and the menu didn't bother listing prices. I felt a flicker of pride as I presented our pitch, the client nodding along, clearly impressed. Ethan, ever the charismatic closer, sealed the deal with his usual effortless charm. Afterward, as the client left, Ethan turned to me. "Great job today, Emma. I couldn't have done it without you." The praise warmed me more than it should have. "Thanks," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He hesitated, then gestured toward the bar. "How about a drink to celebrate? Just one." I hesitated, my instincts warning me that this was a step too far. But his eyes held mine, a quiet plea in their depths, and before I could think better of it, I nodded. The bar was dimly lit, the hum of quiet conversation creating a cocoon of intimacy. Ethan ordered whiskey. I opted for a glass of wine. As we sipped our drinks, the conversation drifted from work to personal topics. He told me about his divorce, the long hours that had cost him his marriage, and the loneliness that came with success. "I don't think I've ever told anyone this," he said, swirling his glass. "But sometimes I wonder if all of this," he gestured around the room, "is worth it." I met his gaze, my heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. "I think about that too," I admitted. "I've worked so hard for this career, but sometimes I feel like I've lost more than I've gained." He reached across the table, his hand brushing mine. The touch was gentle, tentative, but it sent a jolt through me all the same. "You haven't lost everything," he said softly. I pulled my hand back, the reality of the moment crashing down on me. "Ethan, I can't—" "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know this is complicated, but I can't stop thinking about you, Emma." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to run, to put as much distance between us as possible, but another part, a part I wasn't proud of, wanted to stay. "We can't," I said finally, though my voice lacked conviction. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "You're right. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said anything." The drive home was a blur, my thoughts a whirlwind of guilt, confusion, and something I couldn't quite name. When I walked through the door, Sam was sitting at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him. "You're late," he said, his tone more resigned than accusatory. "Meeting ran long," I said, setting my bag down. "We landed the client." "That's great," he said, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "But maybe next time you could call? I was worried." "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it more than he knew. "I'll do better." Over the next week, I threw myself into work, trying to bury the feelings that had taken root. But avoiding Ethan was impossible. Every glance, every meeting, every casual conversation reminded me of the line we'd nearly crossed, and despite my best efforts, I found myself drawn to him like a moth to a flame. The breaking point came on a Friday evening. The office was empty except for the two of us, finishing up a last-minute project. The quiet hum of the building made every sound seem louder. My breathing, the rustle of papers, the faint tap of keys on a keyboard. As I handed him the final draft of the presentation, our fingers brushed. The touch lingered, and when I looked up, his eyes were on me, filled with a longing that mirrored my own. "Emma," he said, his voice low, "I can't keep pretending this isn't happening." I stepped back, my heart racing. Ethan, we can't. This isn't right. I know, he said, running a hand through his hair. But I can't ignore it anymore. Tell me you don't feel it too. The words hung in the air, a challenge I wasn't ready to face, but before I could respond, the sound of a door opening broke the moment. I turned to see the janitor walking in, his cart rattling against the tiled floor. The spell was broken, and I hurried out of the office, my heart pounding. That night, as I lay in bed next to Sam, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I thought about Ethan, about the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. But I also thought about Sam, the man who had stood by me through everything, who loved me despite my flaws. I was caught between two worlds, each pulling me in a different direction. And for the first time, I realized I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to give. The following week began like any other, but the tension between Ethan and me had reached a breaking point. We avoided prolonged conversations, our interactions clipped and professional, as if trying to will away the undercurrent that had taken over. But it was a fragile dam, barely holding back everything we'd left unsaid. Then came the conference. It was an annual industry event, a glamorous affair held at a 5-star hotel, where everyone from junior associates to CEOs networked over champagne and panel discussions. Our firm had secured a booth to showcase our latest campaigns, and Ethan, ever the perfectionist, insisted on overseeing every detail. Naturally, I was tasked with accompanying him. I had packed my bags that morning with a strange mix of excitement and dread. Sam hadn't been thrilled about me staying overnight at the hotel. "Why can't you just come home after the event?" he'd asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Because it runs late and there's an early breakfast meeting tomorrow," I'd explain, forcing a smile. "It's just work, Sam." But the way he looked at me, hurt and mistrust simmering behind his eyes, stayed with me the whole drive to the hotel. The conference was everything I'd expected, sleek, bustling, and slightly overwhelming. Ethan was in his element, moving through the crowd with practiced ease, his charisma drawing people in like moths to a flame. I followed his lead, handling the creative presentations while he worked the room. But as the evening wore on, the professional veneer began to slip. It started with the way his hand brushed my back as he guided me through the crowded ballroom. Then came the subtle compliments. How stunning I looked in my dress, how he couldn't have pulled this off without me. Each comment felt like a spark, igniting something I couldn't quite contain. By the time the gala dinner rolled around, the tension was palpable. We sat next to each other at the long table, surrounded by clients and colleagues, but it felt like we were in our own bubble. His knee brushed mine under the table, and though I told myself it was accidental, he didn't move away. After dessert, Ethan leaned close, his voice low in my ear. "Can we talk?" "Somewhere quiet." I hesitated, glancing around the room. But the way he looked at me, earnest, almost pleading, made it impossible to say no. We found ourselves in a secluded corner of the hotel terrace, the city lights twinkling below us. The night air was cool, but my skin burned with anticipation. "Emma," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "I know I shouldn't be saying this, but I can't keep pretending. I can't keep acting like I don't feel this, whatever this is between us." My heart pounded in my chest. "Ethan, this isn't right. I'm married. You're my boss." "I know," he said, stepping closer, "and I've tried to respect that. But every time I see you, every time we talk, it gets harder to ignore. You make me feel alive, Emma, like I'm not just going through the motions. His words mirrored my own unspoken thoughts, the ones I'd been too afraid to admit. Ethan, I don't know if I can do this, I whispered, my voice trembling. I love my husband. And I'm not asking you to stop, he said, his gaze piercing. I'm just asking you to be honest with yourself, with me. Can you look me in the eye and tell me you don't feel the same way? I opened my mouth to deny it, to push him away, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, tears pricked my eyes as I shook my head. I don't know what I feel, I admitted. I'm so confused. He reached out, his hand brushing my cheek. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, and it sent a shiver down my spine. You don't have to decide anything tonight, he said softly. Just let me be here for you. Let me be someone you don't have to pretend with. Before I could respond, the terrace door opened and a group of conference attendees spilled out, laughing and chatting. Ethan stepped back, the moment broken, but the intensity in his eyes remained. Good night, Emma, he said, his voice low. Get some rest. That night, I lay in my hotel room staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed his words, his touch, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. Guilt churned in my stomach, but so did something else, something thrilling and terrifying all at once. When my phone buzzed, I nearly jumped. It was a text from Ethan. Can't sleep. Thinking of you. Good night. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. Against my better judgment, I typed a response. Me too. Good night, Ethan. The next morning, the conference continued with workshops and networking sessions. Ethan and I maintained a professional front, but every shared glance, every fleeting touch, felt like a secret just waiting to be discovered. As the day wound down, Ethan approached me, his expression unreadable. Let's grab dinner, he said, just the two of us. I hesitated, every rational part of me screaming to say no, but the pull was too strong. The line between right and wrong blurring with every passing second. The restaurant was quiet and intimate, the kind of place where conversations were hushed and the lighting was soft and forgiving. Over wine and shared plates we talked, not about work, but about ourselves. He told me about his childhood, his struggles to prove himself, and the loneliness that came with success. I told him about my marriage, the cracks that had formed over the years, and the pressure I felt to be everything to everyone. I feel like I'm losing myself, I admitted, my voice breaking, like I don't even know who I am anymore. Ethan reached across the table, his hand covering mine. You're not lost, Emma, he said, his voice firm. You're stronger than you realize. You just need someone to remind you. The moment stretched, the world around us fading into the background, and then, without thinking, I leaned forward. Our lips met, soft and hesitant at first, but quickly deepening into something more. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and wide-eyed, reality came crashing down. I should go, I said, my voice shaking. This was a mistake. But as I left the restaurant, my heart pounding and my mind racing, I knew the truth. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The memory of the kiss clung to me like smoke, haunting every quiet moment. Even as I sat at my desk, trying to lose myself in work, my thoughts betrayed me. Ethan's words, the warmth of his touch, the way he looked at me as though I were the only person in the world. All of it played on an endless loop in my mind. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just a fleeting mistake, a moment of weakness. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Ethan and I avoided each other as much as we could in the days that followed. Our interactions were clipped and professional, carefully devoid of the warmth and familiarity that had developed over the past months. But the tension was undeniable, humming just beneath the surface like a live wire. Every glance, every fleeting moment in the hallway felt charged with unspoken words. It was exhausting, pretending nothing had happened when everything had. At home, the distance between Sam and me grew wider. He tried to reach out, asking me to sit with him on the couch, suggesting we order in from our favorite Thai place. But I always found an excuse. "I'm tired," I'd say, or "I have so much work to catch up on." Each time I saw the hurt in his eyes, and it twisted the knife of guilt a little deeper. The weekend of the conference loomed large. It was an annual event, one of the biggest in our industry, and an important opportunity for the firm. Ethan and I were both scheduled to attend, along with a handful of other colleagues. Sam hadn't been happy about it. "Do you really need to stay overnight?" he asked as I packed my bag in the bedroom. His voice was calm, but I could hear the tension beneath it. "Yes," I said, carefully folding a blouse into my suitcase. "There's a networking breakfast early Sunday morning. Driving back and forth wouldn't make sense." He sat on the edge of the bed, watching me. "It's just, you've been so busy lately, I feel like I hardly see you." I paused, my hands hovering over the suitcase. "I know," I said softly. "When I get back, let's plan something, just us. A weekend away, maybe." "Promise?" "Promise," I said, forcing a smile I didn't feel. The conference was a whirlwind of activity. The hotel buzzed with energy, a mix of panel discussions, keynote speeches, and endless networking opportunities. Ethan and I worked seamlessly, presenting to clients and showcasing our campaigns. To anyone watching, we were nothing more than a professional team. But beneath the surface, the tension between us crackled like a live wire. That evening, the gala dinner was a glittering affair. I wore a sleek black dress, and Ethan, in his tailored suit, looked every bit the commanding presence he always was. We were seated at the same table, surrounded by colleagues and clients, but it felt as though we were in our own bubble. His knee brushed against mine under the table, and though I told myself it was accidental, the thrill that shot through me said otherwise. After dessert, Ethan leaned toward me, his voice low. "Can we talk somewhere quiet?" I hesitated, glancing around the room. "Ethan, I don't think—" "Please," he said, his eyes pleading. "Just 5 minutes." I nodded reluctantly, following him out to the terrace. The city lights sparkled in the distance, the cool night air doing little to calm my racing heart. On the terrace, the conversation began cautiously. Ethan seemed hesitant, his usual confidence replaced with a quiet vulnerability. He leaned against the railing, staring out at the skyline. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about last night," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it was a mistake, but I can't bring myself to regret it. Can you?" I wrapped my arms around myself, as though trying to shield against the truth in his words. "Ethan, it's not right. I'm married. You're my boss." "I know," he said, turning to face me. "And I've tried to respect that. But every time I see you, every time we talk, it gets harder to pretend there's nothing there. You don't understand, I said, my voice trembling. Sam and we've been through so much. I can't just throw that away. I'm not asking you to, he said, stepping closer. I'm just asking you to be honest with yourself, with me. Can you look me in the eye and tell me you don't feel the same? I opened my mouth to deny it, to push him away, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, tears welled in my eyes as I shook my head. I don't know what I feel, I whispered. I'm so confused. Ethan reached out, his hand brushing my cheek. The touch was gentle, tentative, but it sent a shiver through me. You don't have to decide anything tonight, he said softly. Just let me be here for you. Let me be someone you don't have to pretend with. Before I could respond, the terrace door opened, and a group of conference attendees stepped outside, their laughter shattering the moment. Ethan stepped back, his hand falling to his side. "Good night, Emma," he said quietly before walking away. That night, back in my hotel room, I stared at my phone, my thoughts a tangled mess. Sam had texted me earlier, a simple "how's it going?" I typed out a brief response, short, vague, and heavy with guilt, before setting the phone aside. But minutes later, it buzzed again. This time, it was Ethan. "I'm sorry. I hope you're okay. Good night." My heart ached at the words. Against my better judgment, I typed a reply. "Me too. Good night, Ethan." The next morning, I returned home feeling like I was carrying the weight of the world. Sam greeted me at the door, pulling me into a hug. "Welcome home," he said, his voice warm and familiar. I clung to him, the guilt nearly suffocating me. "I missed you," I said, and for a moment, I almost believed it. We spent the evening together, a quiet dinner followed by a movie on the couch. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that everything could go back to normal. But even as I rested my head on Sam's shoulder, my mind drifted to Ethan. His words, his touch, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. When I returned to work, the fragile equilibrium shattered. Ethan and I tried to keep our interactions professional, but the tension was unbearable. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. That night, as I sat on the couch with Sam, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. He picked it up before I could stop him. "Who's Ethan?" he asked, his voice tight. My heart stopped. "He's my boss," I said quickly. "It's just work." "Work doesn't text you at midnight, Emma." The argument that followed was brutal. Years of resentment and unspoken fears bubbling to the surface. Sam accused me of being distant, of prioritizing my career over our marriage. I tried to defend myself, but the truth was, he wasn't wrong. By the end of it, Sam grabbed his keys and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I sank to the floor, the weight of my choices crushing me. I'd wanted so badly to hold on to both worlds, to be the perfect wife and the perfect employee. But now, it felt like I was losing everything. The door slammed behind Sam, leaving a vacuum of silence that felt almost deafening. I sat there on the floor of the living room, my head in my hands, the weight of my choices pressing down like an unbearable burden. I thought I could balance it all, juggle my career, my marriage, and whatever fragile connection had begun to form between Ethan and me. But now, as I sat alone, I realized I had been living in a house of cards, and it had finally collapsed. I didn't know how long I stayed there, staring blankly at the floor. My mind replayed the argument with Sam, his hurt and anger etched into his every word. "Do you even care about us anymore?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "Because it doesn't feel like it. It feels like you've already checked out." I hadn't answered him. I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I did, but I was too ashamed to admit it. The next morning, I arrived at the office looking like a ghost of myself. My eyes were puffy from lack of sleep, and my clothes felt like they belonged to someone else, a version of me who hadn't yet unraveled. I avoided Ethan's gaze as I walked to my desk, though I could feel his eyes on me. He didn't say anything, but I knew he could sense that something was wrong. By lunchtime, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to escape, even if just for a moment. I grabbed my coat and slipped out of the office, heading to the small park a few blocks away. The crisp air stung my cheeks, but it was a welcome distraction from the chaos in my mind. I found a bench near the fountain and sat down, staring at the water as it rippled and flowed. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I hesitated before pulling it out, until a text from Sam. "I'll be staying at my brother's for a while. I need some space." My heart sank. I wanted to respond, to tell him I was sorry, that I would do whatever it took to fix things, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I typed a simple "okay" and hit send. It felt woefully inadequate, but I didn't know what else to say. When I returned to the office, Ethan was waiting for me. He was leaning against my desk, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. I nodded, following him to his office. He closed the door behind us, the sound echoing in the silence. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He leaned against the edge of his desk, his hands gripping the surface as though he needed the support. "What's going on, Emma?" he asked finally. "You've been distant all day." I hesitated, my hands twisting nervously. "Sam and we had a fight last night, a bad one. He's staying at his brother's for now." Ethan's brow furrowed, concern flickering in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I know how much he means to you." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and unfamiliar. "Do you? Because sometimes I'm not even sure how much he means to me anymore." The words slipped out before I could stop them, and I immediately regretted it. Ethan's expression shifted, his concern deepening. "Emma," he began, but I cut him off. "Don't," I said, my voice trembling. "Don't try to make this better. It's not something you can fix." He straightened, stepping closer. "I'm not trying to fix anything. I care about you, and I hate seeing you like this." His words, so simple and earnest, made my chest tighten. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "This is all my fault," I whispered. "I've been so focused on work, on trying to prove myself, that I've let everything else fall apart, and now I don't know how to put it back together." Ethan reached out, his hand brushing mine. The touch was light, but it sent a jolt through me. "You don't have to do it alone," he said. "Whatever you need, I'm here." His words were like a lifeline, and for a moment I let myself believe them. But then reality crashed down again, sharp and unforgiving. "I can't do this," they said, pulling my hand away. "I can't keep leaning on you like this. It's not fair. To you, to Sam, to anyone." Ethan looked as though he wanted to argue, but he held back. "I understand," he said quietly, "but if you ever change your mind, you know where to find me." The rest of the day passed in a blur. I buried myself in work, desperate for something, anything, to distract me from the storm inside my head. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of a precipice, teetering dangerously close to the fall. When I finally left the office that evening, I was surprised to find Ethan waiting for me outside. He was leaning against his car, his coat pulled tight against the cold. "What are you doing here?" I asked, stopping a few feet away. "I wanted to make sure you got home okay," he said simply. I frowned, crossing my arms. "I'm fine, Ethan. You don't have to babysit me." He shrugged, his breath visible in the chilly air. "Maybe I don't, but I want it to." There was something in his tone, something soft and unyielding, that made it impossible to argue. I sighed, my shoulders slumping. "Thanks," I said quietly, "but I think I need to be alone tonight." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Okay, but if you need anything—" "I know," I said, cutting him off, "thanks." I turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing on the pavement. I didn't look back, but I could feel his eyes on me until I disappeared around the corner. That night, I sat in the darkened living room, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I thought about Sam, about the life we'd built together, the promises we'd made. I thought about Ethan, about the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. And I thought about myself, the woman I had been, the woman I was now, and the woman I wanted to be. I didn't have any answers, but for the first time in a long time, I knew I needed to start asking the right questions. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I made a silent promise to myself. I would figure out what I wanted, what I needed, and I would fight for it. No more running, no more hiding. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Because if I didn't, I knew I would lose everything. The days that followed were a strange limbo. Sam's absence loomed over everything, his side of the bed cold and untouched. The house felt unnervingly quiet, as though it had absorbed the tension of our fight and refused to let it dissipate. I busied myself with work, staying late at the office, even when there wasn't much to do. It was easier than going home to an empty house. Ethan, for his part, gave me space. Our interactions remained professional, his warm presence tempered with restraint. He didn't ask questions, didn't press me for updates on my personal life. And yet, I could feel him watching, his concern an unspoken thread that bound us even in silence. One evening, as I sat at my desk staring at a spreadsheet that refused to make sense, my phone buzzed. It was Sam. My stomach flipped as I picked it up, hesitating for a moment before answering. "Hi," I said, my voice shaky. "Hi," he replied. His tone was neutral, but I could hear the strain beneath it. "How are you?" "I'm okay," I said softly. "How about you?" "I'm figuring things out," he said after a pause. "Emma, I think we need to talk." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "I think so too." "Tomorrow night?" he asked. "At the house?" "Okay," I agreed, my heart pounding. Tomorrow night. The next day was a blur of nerves and second-guessing. By the time evening rolled around, I was wound so tightly I thought I might snap. I arrived home to find Sam already there, sitting at the kitchen table with his hands clasped in front of him. "Hi," I said, setting my bag down. "Thanks for coming." He nodded, motioning for me to sit. I took the chair across from him, the distance between us feeling insurmountable despite the small space. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Sam began, his voice steady but strained. "About us, about everything." I nodded, unsure of what to say. "I know I haven't been perfect," he continued. "I've let my frustration get the better of me, and I haven't always communicated the way I should. But Emma, I need to know where your head is, where your heart is." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "Sam, are you happy?" he interrupted, his voice breaking. "Because I feel like I've been trying so hard to hold on to something that you've already let go of." The question hung in the air, heavy and unbearable. I wanted to tell him I was happy, that I loved him, that everything would be okay. But the truth was far more complicated. "I don't know," I admitted, tears welling in my eyes. "I don't know if I'm happy. I don't know who I am anymore. I feel like I've been running on autopilot for so long, just trying to keep everything together, that I've lost sight of everything." Sam's expression softened, but the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. "Do you want to fix this? Do you want us?" I opened my mouth, the words stuck in my throat. "I want to want us," I said finally, my voice trembling. "But I don't know if I can be the person you need me to be right now." The silence that followed was deafening. Sam leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening as he processed my words. "I appreciate your honesty," he said quietly, "but I don't know if I can keep doing this. I don't know if I can wait for you to figure it out." His words felt like a knife to the chest, but I knew he was right. He deserved more than my uncertainty, more than the fractured pieces of myself I had to offer. After Sam left, the house felt emptier than ever. I wandered aimlessly from room to room, the echoes of our life together haunting every corner. I didn't cry. I felt too numb for that. Instead, I sat on the couch and stared out the window, the weight of everything crashing down around me. The next morning, I dragged myself to work, desperate for a distraction, but as soon as I stepped into the office, I knew it wouldn't come. Ethan was waiting for me near my desk, his expression carefully neutral. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, following him into his office. He closed the door behind us, leaning against his desk with his arms crossed. "What happened?" he asked, his concern evident. "Sam and I talked last night," I said, my voice hollow. "We're taking a break." Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze searching mine. "How do you feel about that?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Relieved, maybe? Sad? Guilty? All of it." He stepped closer, his presence steady and grounding. "Emma, you don't have to have all the answers right now. Sometimes it's okay to just be." His words were comforting, but they also stirred something in me. A longing for the simplicity he offered, the connection that felt so effortless between us. And yet, I couldn't ignore the voice in my head, reminding me of the mess I'd already made. "Ethan," I said, my voice certainly above a whisper. "I don't know if I can do this." He frowned, his brow furrowing. "Do what?" "Us, whatever this is," I said, gesturing vaguely between us. "I'm not in a place to figure out my marriage, let alone this." His expression shifted, disappointment flickering across his face, but he nodded, stepping back. "I understand," he said quietly. "If you ever change your mind." "I know," I interrupted, my heart aching at the hurt in his voice. "Thank you for everything." The weeks that followed were a period of quiet reflection. Sam and I spoke occasionally, our conversations polite but distant. I gave him the space he needed, hoping that in time we might find a way back to each other, or at least some form of closure. Ethan, too, kept his distance, though I could feel his presence lingering in the periphery. There were moments when I caught him watching me, his expression unreadable, and I wondered if things would ever truly go back to the way they were. But perhaps that was the point. Maybe they weren't meant to. One evening, as I walked home from work, I found myself pausing outside a small cafe. Through the window, I saw a couple laughing together, their hands intertwined across the table. For a moment, I felt a pang of longing. For simplicity, for connection, for something that felt real and unburdened. As I continued down the street, I realized something important. I didn't have all the answers, and I might not for a long time, but I was finally asking the right questions, and that was a start. For now, that was enough. The weeks that followed were quieter than I had anticipated, though not in a way that brought peace. Sam was still staying with his brother, our conversations sporadic and painfully polite. We spoke as though tiptoeing around something fragile, both of us unsure whether it was worth salvaging or simply letting it break. At the office, Ethan and I fell into a rhythm of professionalism, careful to avoid moments that might open doors we had both tentatively closed. I told myself I was moving forward, but there were nights when the silence in my house felt oppressive, the absence of both Sam and Ethan a reminder of what I had lost and what I had nearly risked everything for. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when the twist came. I was sitting at my desk reviewing campaign notes when my phone buzzed with a message from Sam. It was unusual for him to text me during work hours, and my stomach twisted as I opened it. "Can we talk tonight? I'll come to the house." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The uncertainty of what he might say was overwhelming. Was he ready to reconcile? Or was this the conversation where he would ask for an official separation? I typed back a simple, "Yes, I'll be home," and set the phone down with trembling hands. That evening, I waited anxiously, the seconds stretching into minutes as I sat on the couch, staring at the door. When Sam finally arrived, he looked tired but resolute, his expression giving nothing away. "Hi," I said, standing awkwardly as he stepped inside. "Hi," he replied, shrugging off his jacket. "Thanks for letting me come by." "Of course," I said, motioning for him to sit. "Do you want something to drink? Coffee? Tea?" He shook his head, his eyes scanning the room before settling on me. "No, I'm fine. I needed to talk to you." I sat down across from him, my heart racing. "Okay, I'm listening." He took a deep breath, his hands resting on his knees. "Emma, I've been doing a lot of thinking over the past few weeks. About us, about what went wrong, about where we go from here." I nodded, my throat tightening. "I know I haven't been perfect," he continued, "and I know I've put a lot of pressure on you to fix things, to be the person I needed you to be, but the truth is, I haven't been completely honest with you." I frowned, confusion creeping in. "What do you mean?" He looked away, his jaw tightening. "While you've been struggling with work, with everything else, I've been dealing with my own issues, and I wasn't strong enough to talk to you about them." My chest tightened as I watched him wrestle with his words. "Emma," he said finally, meeting my eyes, "there's someone else." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. For a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. What? I whispered, my voice barely audible. It wasn't planned, he said quickly. It just happened. She's someone I work with. And it started during a time when I felt like we were drifting so far apart, like I didn't know how to reach you anymore. I stared at him, disbelief and betrayal warring within me. How long? I asked, my voice shaking. 6 months, he admitted, his voice filled with regret. But it's over now. I ended it weeks ago, before our fight. I realized I couldn't keep lying to you, or to myself. The room felt like it was spinning. I had spent so much time wrestling with my own guilt over Ethan, convincing myself that I was the one who had destroyed our marriage. And now this? I don't even know what to say, I said, tears blurring my vision. I'm not telling you this to hurt you, Sam said. I'm telling you because I want to be honest. If there's any chance of us rebuilding this, it has to start with the truth. I shook my head, standing and pacing the room. Rebuilding? Sam, you cheated on me. You've been lying to me for months. How am I supposed to just move past that? I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, he said, standing as well. I don't even know if I deserve your forgiveness. But I love you, Emma. I always have. And I want to fight for us, if you're willing to fight too. His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how deeply he had hurt me. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the hypocrisy of my own actions. I had been steps away from an affair myself, emotionally entangled with a man who wasn't my husband. Did I even have the right to cast judgment? After Sam left, I sat in the living room for hours, replaying the conversation in my mind. My emotions were a tangled mess: anger, sadness, guilt, and a sliver of something I couldn't quite name. Clarity, maybe, or the beginning of it. I thought about Ethan, about the way he had looked at me that day in his office, offering his support without expectation. I thought about Sam, about the life we had built, and the cracks that had formed beneath its surface. And I thought about myself, the choices I had made, the person I had become, and the person I wanted to be. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Ethan. I told him I needed to take some time away from the office, to sort through everything without the constant reminder of what might have been. He was understanding, his voice steady and supportive as he wished me well. The second was to Sam. I told him I needed time to think, time to heal, time to figure out if we could truly rebuild what had been broken. He agreed, though I could hear the sadness in his voice. For the first time in months, I felt like I was taking control of my life instead of letting it control me. Months later, I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, a small but cozy space I had rented to give myself the distance I needed. The city stretched out before me, alive with possibility. I didn't know what the future held, for me, for Sam, or even for Ethan. But for the first time in a long time, I was okay with not knowing. Because sometimes the best thing you can do is let go of the past and step into the unknown. The months that followed were a journey I hadn't expected, but one I desperately needed. After moving into my new apartment, I took time to strip my life down to its essentials. Time for myself, free from the expectations of others, free from the noise of what I should or shouldn't do. For the first time in years, I prioritized understanding who I was and what I wanted. I stayed in therapy, where I unpacked not just the choices I had made, but the years of habits and pressures that had led me to them. I learned to stop running from the truth, to face my mistakes, and to accept the parts of myself I hadn't wanted to confront. I began to see how I'd let the drive to succeed, the need to be perfect, swallow whole parts of my life, leaving me too fragmented to hold anything together. Sam and I stayed in contact, though the conversations were never easy. He respected my need for space, but there were times when his sadness slipped through, moments when he asked if I could ever see us finding our way back to each other. I don't know, I would say honestly. I'm still figuring out how to find my way back to myself. And he understood, even though it hurt. Ethan, on the other hand, faded quietly into the background. He continued to lead at the office with the same poise and confidence that had first drawn me to him, but there was a noticeable shift in his demeanor when we crossed paths. He was careful, reserved, his eyes softer but distant, as if acknowledging the boundary we had established without ever needing to speak of it again. It wasn't anger or rejection between us, just an understanding that whatever had almost happened wasn't meant to be. And in that understanding, there was peace. One particularly crisp autumn afternoon, I found myself walking through the park near my apartment. The leaves were vibrant shades of red and gold, swirling gently in the breeze. Children played on the playground, their laughter a lightness I hadn't realized I needed to hear. For the first time in months, I felt calm. Not happy exactly, but a kind of quiet contentment that felt like the beginning of something better. I sat on a bench, watching the world move around me. I thought about Sam, about the love we had shared, the life we had built, and the fractures that had ultimately undone us. I thought about Ethan, about the moments we had stolen and the feelings we hadn't dared to name. And then I thought about myself, the woman I had been before I'd let the weight of it all pull me down, and the woman I was becoming. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I was okay with that. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing on solid ground, ready to take each step as it came. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the park in shades of amber and gold, I pulled out a notebook from my bag, a habit I had started during my time alone. In its pages were my thoughts, my fears, my hopes for the future. I opened to a blank page and wrote, "Sometimes the hardest thing isn't choosing between two paths. It's realizing that neither path was meant for you, and finding